Professor Akihiko Tanaka, President of GRIPS in Japan, distinguished panelists, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Good day to all of you and welcome to this GRIPS-RSIS workshop on regional economic integration in the post-pandemic era. First and foremost, I would like to thank GRIPS for initiating this collaboration on this particularly timely topic. As we always say here in RSIS, regional economic integration is a topic that never goes out of style. For good reason. Strengthening trade and investment linkages across the region is one path towards diversifying our respective economies and boosting economic growth for ourselves, our respective country, that is, as well as the region and globally. We look at one particular data point from the UN Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, or in short, UNSCAP. UNSCAP has projected a lower regional GDP growth for 2022. They are forecasting 4.9% due to reduced consumption and export demand. In some school of thoughts, meanwhile, enmeshing allies and non-allies alike in trade and investment networks contribute to peace via interdependence. So there are various ideas and suggestions out there in the marketplace to integrate our respective economies. Regional economic integration is important against the slowdown in what is happening at the WTO, World Trade Organization. WTO is struggling to update its own rulebook. Regional trade agreements and forums therefore provide a means to fill in the gap or the slowdown at the WTO, and hopefully our regional trade arrangements will allow us to try out new things which can subsequently be applied under the WTO framework. Boosting regional economic integration has not been without challenges, particularly in recent years. You have seen the global COVID-19 pandemic. Supply chain have been disrupted, and these have also exacerbated the protectionist sentiments we see in different countries. Trade is trickier with the pandemic-induced barriers to the movement of people, trade in goods and services. Consequently, rulemaking has been delayed, and there are various ways in which countries around the world try to make up for the disruption caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. Yet, all these things about Zoom diplomacy, online discussion, cannot replace the need for in-person interaction. The Asia-Pacific, or some people call it the Indo-Pacific, has also become a more complex and uncertain environment, not only for trade, but for a variety of interstate activities. Tension between the United States and China has given rise to a lot of other developments. And with the COVID-19 disrupting supply chain and creating uncertainty for the business sector, we are indeed in a very difficult moment for the regional economic integration. But nevertheless, we have to continue. Trade is important to all of us, and over the past few decades, the benefit of interdependence have been obvious to all the countries in our region, notwithstanding the big powers struggling to take advantage of each other's strength and lobby for more advantages for each of their own economies. There are several important questions. What is the likely trajectory of US-Singapore-China relations? How these relations can be affecting US-China ties, as well as US-China relations with countries like Japan and other important countries in the region. How will the regional economic order be going forward? What are the rules, features, and logic? What role do the existing regional arrangements such as the RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, as well as the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, play in moving our economic integration forward? Bear in mind, ladies and gentlemen, that these agreements are what we call live agreements. They are subject to revision with the changing of times and membership. Question, therefore, is how do they get updated, and what inspiration can we pick up from other experiences by smaller and more focused, what we call minilateral diplomacy and discussions. In particular, we have this particular development called the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, DEPA. We all appreciate that we are now in a digital era, and everything we do revolve around the digital systems and digital platforms. So what can DEPA, or the negotiation for DEPA, tell us and prepare us for the broader regional economic integration? Then in recent days, we are also talking about the addition or absence of certain countries to our regional trading arrangements. The UK is a good example. It has left the EU and it is active in our region, Southeast Asia in particular. So, what are the prospects of those existing agreements we have now contributing to a broader involvement by other newer members or countries outside our region? To make matters worse, most of these countries interested in our region's economic growth and future economic benefits, they don't see eye to eye on many other big interstate relations. So all these issues will complicate our economic rulemaking, our trade arrangements with one another, and the tendency is to let the existing barriers or more obstacles be thrown into the marketplace in order to maintain the respective advantages that some of the countries in the region would like to have for themselves. So, a big question for this session that we are having today is really whether the RCEP and the CPTPP, are they an insurance policy to sustain us on the path for economic integration? And if not, what are the things we have to do to make sure that all these big regional free trade agreements will help to sustain the regional economic integration that all our respective governments have embarked on in the past few decades? I will stop here, ladies and gentlemen, and I look forward to a fruitful discussion today and learn from all your wise ideas and exchanges. Thank you very much for your attention.
His Excellency, Ambassador Ong Keng Yong, Executive Director, Chairman, S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, RSIS. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great honor and privilege for me to welcome researchers and experts from all over the world to the GRIPS-RSIS workshop. GRIPS is collaborating with RSIS to promote various intellectual exchange activities, such as joint research and webinars like this. In September 2019, GRIPS, together with RSIS and CSIS of Indonesia, launched the Policy Research Network of Contemporary Southeast Asia, PRNC. This network has been conducting joint research in various areas, including great power rivalry and maritime order and sustainable economic growth. In this endeavor, RSIS has played a leading role in the joint research, including hosting the inaugural meeting of PRN-SEA in Singapore. RSIS has also co-chaired more than 10 CSIS, GRIPS-RSIS webinars under the PRNC framework, and has been engaged in fruitful discussions with universities and research institutes in ASEAN and ASEAN dialogue partners on the changing strategic and economic order in Asia and the way forward for the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific. Today, I'm extremely pleased that GRIPS and RSIS are jointly organizing an international workshop on regional economic integration in the post-pandemic era by inviting researchers and experts across the regions. Since the 1980s, East Asia, especially ASEAN, has seen the expansion of industrial supply chains as a result of the growth of foreign direct investment. And de facto regional economic integration has proceeded in the region. Since the 1990s, the networking of FTAs, such as AFTA, ASEAN Plus One FTA, RCEP, and CPTPP has progressed, and de jure regional economic integration has boosted de facto regional economic integration. In the midst of geopolitical tectonic shifts in Asia, particularly with the coming of the tensions between China and the United States, and in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, I think it is necessary to promote the formation of high-quality rules through various trade frameworks such as RCEP, CPTPP, and WTO in order to stabilize the economic order in the region. We are now entering a new phase of regional economic integration, such as the entry into force of the RCEP and the request of China and Taiwan to join the CPTPP. We are faced with a major issue, that is how to promote regional economic integration in Asia in order to improve the quality of mega FTAs and expand their membership. In addition, supply chains, especially in Asia, are greatly affected not only by the US-China rivalry, but also by various other factors such as natural disasters, pandemics, green growth, and human rights. Under these circumstances, how to build a trustworthy supply chain by using digital technology and in collaboration with like-minded countries will be a challenge for governments and industries in the future. As the program indicates, today we are discussing 1, the impact of COVID-19 pandemic and the US-China strategic competition on the regional economic order. 2, the direction of regional economic integration in Asia beyond RCEP and CPTPP. And 3, strengthening supply chain resilience. With the participations of excellent panelists, I'm sure that we are able to have constructive and insightful discussion, which I hope could lead to useful policy recommendations that can be reported to the Intergovernmental Track 1 Forum in the future. In conclusion, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to Ambassador Ong Ken-yong and all those involved in organizing this workshop, as well as to researchers and experts who will present in the sessions today. With this, I'll stop my opening remarks. Thank you very much.
So good morning, everyone. I'm giving you a warm welcome, to the very first session of the GRIPS-RSIS workshop on regional economic integration in the post-pandemic era. I'd like to share with you that the first session will be devoted to three different but closely related questions. So first, we are going to think about how the global pandemic and the rivalry between the US and China has affected economic cooperation so far. And then secondly, how do multiple responses of governments to this major event shape the regional economic order? And then the last question we would like to explore is, what regional trade or economic cooperation will look like in a pandemic or in a post-pandemic era. So today, we're having three great speakers, who will share their thoughts and views, with the audience on these issues, from the perspectives of the US, China, and ASEAN, respectively. So I'd like to say that, while listening to their presentations, you can submit your questions, using a chat box, at the bottom of the Zoom platform. So without further ado, I would like to invite our first speaker, Dr. Arjun Park. She is a Fung Global Fellow at the Princeton Institute for International and Regional Studies at Princeton University, United States. Dr. Park, over to you.
Thank you, and thank you to RSIS and GRIPS for extending an invitation to discuss this very important topic. I'm a political economist by training, and I have been asked to provide some of the American or US views on this issue, but at the same time, what I'd like to throw out to the rest of the audience is basically a political economist view on all of the questions that were given to me in order to address these issues. And then I will append some of the US views in relation to the topics that we were supposed to address as panelists. So on the first question of how and whether the COVID-19 pandemic and the US-China strategic competition have evolved, or how the pandemic has actually influenced this strategic competition, there are four things to consider. Number one is that economic cooperation has been hindered or exacerbated compared to pre-pandemic levels, and that multilateralism has failed immensely, especially on PPEs during the first year of the pandemic, and also on vaccine distribution. And secondly, chip shortage, global chip shortage that has happened from the second year of the pandemic has exacerbated this tension as the global economy is headed towards more of a digital kind of a platform, digital and contactless form. And this transition, thirdly, this transition will make the use of data in our global economy the most pivotal element. And fourthly, multilateralism will certainly not be the main point of global interest mobilization. Perhaps in the mode of regional collaboration or bilateral collaboration, this would be the norm, but single undertaking forms at the WTO, this is not going to be our main mode of collaboration into the next years. So if you add a little bit of US perspective here on global supply chains, let me point to semiconductors for the most part, so chips for the most part. The US is determined to overcome the crisis that's compounded by geopolitics and the chip crunch. Whether the CHIPS Act that has been passed would be enough would be questionable, because this is not just a matter of creating more fabs in the United States, but it's more of a strategic rivalry plus technological rivalry. Who gets to have the upper hand as technology further progresses into the coming years. And it's not just about fabrication capacity, but it's also about how companies are able to retain that technological leadership. So there's a question there for the US side. But looking at Intel's moves, it's very, very clear that the US is determined to utilize all interests, both private and public mobilized interests, in order to sustain leadership, because the US has invented semiconductors and wants to be in the lead. Second, so on the question of how do governments' responses to these events shape the regional economic order, there are also 4 things to consider. And one thing for the critical assessment, the existing trade rules thus far and the shifting global order, the existing rules that Ambassador Ong Keng-yong has mentioned at the WTO, established based upon the Marrakesh Agreement in 1995, they were written with a very wide discretion of states to use national security to protect trade. It worked fine until there were rivalries and national security interests embedded. Most of the economies in the existing trade order, they were friends or allies, or they were not adversaries at least. And inclusion of China and Russia into the system have further complicated this issue. And whether they were allies or small markets, it didn't really matter much as long as there was leadership in this structure, which was the US or transatlantic partnership. But now there is plenty of reason to use the national security clause, which is my second point. Export controls are becoming a policy tool. It's not just about PPE masks during COVID-19, but geopolitical tensions give valid reasons for countries to utilize and activate export controls. So say, for instance, the Huawei ban or the entity list, or Japan's export controls on South Korea based on South Korean Supreme Court decision to confiscate cash or confiscate funds from Japanese companies that committed crimes during the Second World War. So those kinds of things, and then backlash attack on the South Korean industry, semiconductor industry. These are all, these are events that occur because export controls are now legitimized. And that now the international economic system faces this biggest rivalry on security dimensions. And these are compounding the deep economic connections, because economic interdependence was the main anchor. And now it's being weaponized in order to support national security interest. And thirdly, on this second topic, existing trade rules are also being challenged because they are being outdated in terms of our economy today. So it is not designed to cope with the next generation innovation, database digital economy, and the public sector is being outplayed by the private sector in this regard, playing catch up. Governments are seeking to harness big tech because they want to see control. And you can see this in China as well as the US. And fourthly, on this topic, second topic, more complications are expected if and when central banks decide to issue legal digital currencies in order to stand up to cryptocurrencies and stable coins in decentralized finance. To protect central bank independence and monetary policy discretion, in other words, centralized finance. And here, another US perspective would be that the US still believes in the dollar dominance in the global economy, but increasingly there are skeptics within the US apparatus on this issue as well, because what if there is a transition? What if there is a transition in leadership in digital finance? That's the looming question. And lastly, for the third question, what would a post-pandemic vision of regional trade or economic cooperation look like? There are 4 dimensions to this as well. Number one, grouping at the like-minded regional levels is going to be the norm, and like-mindedness is going to be very arbitrary, but it leaves questions open for trade with China. And the second component is that data would be at the frontier of every agreement that is being written or stricken between countries and even in the group orders. So I am pretty sure that Professor Gao will touch upon this issue. And number three, reliance on regional trade or economic cooperation will be conditional, based primarily on very, very strict mutual interest encompassing national security interest. And then lastly, splinternet or more autarkic form of the Chinese economy may be perceived, but not a complete decoupling in the industrial sense, because there is US interest embedded for US industries. But once Chinese domestic firms get to a certain level, they will end partnerships, and companies should brace for that. So I'll end it there.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Park. So now I'd like to invite, our second speaker, Professor Henry Gao. He's a professor at the Yongpeng House School of Law, Singapore Management University, and he is also a senior fellow at Center for International Governance and Innovation. Professor Gao, over to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Lee. Now I want to start by thanking Ambassador Ang and Professor Tanaka for kindly inviting me. I prepared a short slide, so let me just bring up the slide first. Okay. I hope you all can see the slide. Okay. So I think this conference is held at great timing. There has been many factors driving regional economic integration in the Asia Pacific in the past 2 decades, but over the past decade, I would argue that the main driving force has been the strategic competition between the US and China. So today, I will discuss how the US-China strategic competition has shaped the regional economic cooperation from the Chinese perspective, along with the disruptions brought by the COVID pandemic. And I will also conclude with some thoughts on post-pandemic economic cooperation in the region. So if we look at the history of US-China strategic competition, I would argue that 2008 is really a watershed year. Before 2008, the US largely welcomed China's participation in global economic governance as a new member of the WTO and encouraged China to play a bigger role in the multilateral trading system. But their relationships started to become acrimonious after the WTO ministerial held in July 2008 failed to revive the Doha round. So at the time of the negotiations in July 2008, the US actually tried to salvage the round by asking China to provide additional concessions on special products in agriculture and sectoral negotiations on industrial goods. But China declined because China argued that the same demands were not made to the other big emerging powers like India or Brazil. So the US subsequently accused China of basically stalking the round and preventing the round from concluding. And the Chinese ambassador gave a really long diatribe refuting the US government. So the relationship started to go south. Now, another major event that happened in 2008 was the financial crisis. So if you look at what happened in the financial crisis, China basically was able to avoid the contagious effect from the global crisis by maintaining its restrictions on foreign exchange and capital flows. And this kind of bolstered China's confidence in the so-called Beijing model, a model of economic growth that relies heavily on government intervention. So its incomplete market reform, long regarded as an embarrassing failure, is now hailed by the Chinese government as a unique feature of the Chinese system. Moreover, with its emergence as the biggest exporter in 2009, despite global trade contraction by 13%, the Chinese leaders started to question the wisdom of more market-oriented reforms and start to have more confidence in their own model. So these resulted in some strong reaction from the US. The US, concerned with the rise of China, decided to announce the pivot to Asia. stated. Now, even though the TPP did not implicate China directly, but the attacks on China become more blunt after Trump became president in early 2017, when he pushed for decoupling with China, which later escalated into a bilateral trade war where most of the bilateral trade are subject to additional tariffs. So even with the signing of the Phase 1 agreement 2 years ago, the bilateral trade initiative has never. So if you look at this, resulted, I would argue, in fundamental.
Professor Gao, I'm sorry.
Regional economic integration, yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think your voice is breaking down. There were pause. Yeah, just as a note.
Now it's okay.
Yeah, there are some moments, we were losing you, like a pause. Yeah, but yeah, it's okay. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I guess too many people are online these days. Yeah, so thank you. So anyway, if you look at the regional integration in Asia Pacific, they have traditionally been driven by the actors within the region. So this started with China's courtship of ASEAN in 2000 and the week of the Asian financial crisis to launch the FTA negotiation, which was the first for both parties. So China's aggressive FTA strategy, as I was written about earlier, has resulted in a wave of what I would call competitive regionalism among ASEAN's neighbors, as all of its external partners started to negotiate FTAs with ASEAN. So when the US-China strategic competition heated up, the US also started to realize the strategic value of the region, which is reflected in this new pivot to Asia approach. And the centerpiece of this strategy is the TPP, which has been used by the US as a key instrument to rally the allies in the region. In particular, I would argue that two features in the TPP are of particular relevance to China. So the first one is the rules of origin rules. Now, you find such rules in all FTAs, but what is different about the TPP is that it contains some of the strictest rules of origin in an effort to make sure that non-members like China will not free ride. One example is the notorious yarn forwarding rule, which states that for a final apparel product made in the TPP, it would be considered as originating only if such a fabrics are both formed and finished from yarn that is formed and finished in the territory of one or more parties of the TPP. So essentially, this provision was put in place to make sure that China would not be able to piggyback on the provincial access created under the TPP by exporting the yarn to TPP members such as Vietnam. So basically, this is a way by the US to try to cut China out of the regional supply chain. Second, the US also pushed for inclusion of rules on SOEs, competition, and e-commerce. These rules answer Obama's call to make sure that it's the US and not countries like China that is one writing the centrist rule for the world economy. Now, such rule really kind of up the game. To again borrow Obama's speak for regional economic cooperation by preempting the Chinese challenge and informing future discussions on these issues in other regional and global forums such as the WTO. So what are China's reactions? If you look at what China has been doing, China, as you can see, its moves are quite different from the US. Now, China's moves, I would argue, composed of two major components. The first one is rebuilding the supply chain interrupted by the US. So this is mainly done through the launch of negotiation on the RCEP in response to the TPP, and also the launch of the Belt and Road Initiative in the next year. So basically, if you look at both of these initiatives, I mean, the RCEP is basically an attempt to rebuild the regional supply chain in the East and Southeast Asia region. And the BRI is to rebuild the supply chain in a wider region that is not just Asia, but also Africa and Latin America. And this allows China to build its own supply chain without direct confrontation with the US in the Pacific. The second move by China, in contrast with the US approach, which keeps introducing new and stricter rules, is that China adopts the contrary approach and lowers the bar for regional economic integration. Now, one example would be the BRI. So if you look at the BRI, many of the countries, I would argue, in this initiative are low-income developing countries or even LDCs, which have difficulty meeting even the normal rules under the WTO. But China adopts an open approach and doesn't prescribe any condition for participation in the BRI. And this is also reflected in the RCEP, where the rules are also diluted to ensure the maximum participation of all countries. For example, the chapter on e-commerce is subject to extensive exemptions and excluded from the dispute settlement chapter. And this is actually done at the request of not only China, but also some other members such as India. Similarly, China agreed to the removal of the investor-state dispute settlement mechanism from the investment chapter, even though China really wanted to include this by submitting proposals on this. But because of the resistance of certain ASEAN members and also non-ASEAN members like Australia and New Zealand, China also agreed to keep it out. So what are the effects on the COVID-19 pandemic? So the COVID-19 pandemic, according to the WTO, has brought unprecedented disruption to the global economy and world trade. But what is interesting is that the impact of the pandemic on the two largest economies in the world has been uneven, with China ironically seeing its trade surplus jumping 30% in 2021 from the previous year to set a new record, while the US recording a 20% increase in its trade deficit rather than surplus to an all-time high of about $860 billion US. So what are the reasons for the differences? In my 2018 article in the Journal of International Economic Law, contrasting positions to digital trade by the US and China, I argue that their differing approach to digital trade approach can be explained by the different natures of trade, with China focusing more on traditional trade in goods and the US mainly focusing on digital service trade. The same explanation, I would argue, also works here. If we look at COVID trade restrictions around the world, they tend to be mainly restrictions on the movement of person, while trade goods are largely kept free of restrictions. Therefore, naturally, it would affect the more services-oriented economies like the US rather than heavy good exporters like China. Going forward, however, I would argue that the policy choices made by the two countries, especially those on regional economic integration, will also have a bigger impact on their trade performance. On the one hand, the US, since the signing of the USMCA in November 2018, that is more than 3 years ago, has not negotiated any FTAs and currently doesn't have a plan to do so. And the newly announced Indo-Pacific strategy doesn't look like something that will replace the TPP. But during the same time period, if you look at what China has been doing, they've signed FTAs with Mauritius and Cambodia, and they have upgraded their FTAs with Chile, Singapore, ASEAN, Pakistan, and New Zealand, and they have concluded and launched the RCEP, and they have applied to join the TPP and even the DPA. So if you look at what the Biden administration has been doing, since they came into office a year ago, they have been busy promoting its worker-centered trade policy, which unfortunately lacks substance. In review of the controversial nature of trade policy in US domestic politics, I think it's highly unlikely that the US will be able to make major moves in the next 2 to 3 years, because Biden would probably want a second term. Indeed, even the widely anticipated Indo-Pacific economic framework, as I mentioned, would probably end up as more hollow than it sounds, and it will just focus on issues including digital trade, supply chains, and green technology, basically everything other than real trade. So given the well-known resistance to these issues by India, the biggest player in Indo-Pacific, I think the US plan might turn out to be more rhetoric, leaving countries in the region to be subject to more influenced by the economic gravity force of China. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Gao. Now I'd like to move on to our last speaker, Dr. Sanchita Bose-Das. She is an economist at Regional Cooperation and Integration Division under Economic Research and Regional Cooperation Department of Asian Development Bank. Dr. Bose-Das, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So good morning, everyone. Thank you to our RSIS and GRIPS for the invite in this interesting discourse. Let me share my thoughts from ASEAN perspective. Shalu, can you please put up my slides, please? Next slide, please. I have two very short slides, but I will give the explanation and give a concluding remarks. So I will say, like, ASEAN as a region wants all major economies to work with it. In the last 2 years, and I think more currently, recovering from the effect of COVID-19 pandemic is a priority, and it will remain so in the foreseeable future. And for ASEAN, I've been observing ASEAN since like 2002. And so since it has come up with the ASEAN Economic Community Blueprint, ASEAN believes that all member countries and the countries with which it has the institutional partnership need to go for a well-designed cooperation measures rather than competition. And when I say well-designed cooperation measures, I'm not saying things are in like black and white. Sometimes it can be about networking, exchange of information, generating more awareness about certain policy reform, things like that, which needs to be done equally among the 10 member economies rather than go on for a direct policy reform in the domestic economy. And so immediate concern for during this COVID-19 or going forward will be the access to vaccine and efforts to mitigate the economic fallout from this prolonged lockdowns and closures. And these will be the priorities of the ASEAN governments. So even if the major economies seem to set for certain kind of competition, the ASEAN countries will prioritize their own needs and make policy decisions based on their interest and perceived benefits. Next slide, please. So what are the areas we are going to see greater cooperation? Of course, and I will be sharing only a couple of examples, but my view is going forward, ASEAN cooperation will be advanced in few areas, say with, of course, trade and investment will always be a priority or the core interest for the ASEAN countries. So one area where we can see greater integration going forward is the supply chain issue, or I will say like the cross-border trade facilitation measures. And this became very important during the pandemic because we saw major challenges in the early phase of pandemic, primarily because of two reasons, like countries are either part of the global value chain network or there is geographic concentration of production of goods. So, so both these reasons show that the importance of international trade for this region. And these and the countries face the supply chain disruption more because of the local lockdowns or the challenges in cross-border transport. Say, to give you an example for the GVC participation, like in the sectors electronics and textiles or apparels, they got disrupted due to lockdowns in PRC, which affected the flows of parts and components in this region. Say about around 40 to 60% of electronics components for factories in Indonesia, Thailand, and Vietnam are sourced from the PRC. And again, around 55% of inputs for the apparel factories in Cambodia, Myanmar, and Vietnam comes from the same country. So looking for the geographic concentration, PRC was the largest supplier of face masks, medical goggles, and protective gowns to global economy in 2019. But they directed the same for its own use in 2020, and it lowered its export. So there was an immediate shortfall in importing countries, particularly when COVID cases were rising rapidly. Of course, there were export controls for major ingredients or the final products. But as we progressed from 2020 to 2021, we saw many of those restrictions were either removed or lowered over time. So in addition to these challenges, we also saw some issues with the transport and shipping during the lockdown and the time when the countries were coming up with the social distancing protocols. And all of these caused delays and shortages of goods in the important countries. So I feel like ASEAN countries will pay particular attention to supply chain disruption, and they will try to expedite their area of initiatives in the trade facilitation measures. It has, of course, set up the national and the regional single windows, and it is greatly encouraging electronic submission of the trade-related documents. And during COVID time, we saw that the countries expedited implementation of the simplified customs procedures. We also saw during the COVID-19 period, or during the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic, the 10 countries decided to remove restriction on the intra-regional trade for medicines, at least for 2 years. I think it will end in this year, in 2022 end. And they have removed tariff lines for tariffs across 152 essential medical goods that covers soaps, disinfectant, face mask, and many others. The other area of cooperation that may increase post-pandemic is the tourism sector. The sector was very important for ASEAN as it contributes around 15% of the region's GDP and around same percentage in the total employment in the region. During COVID pandemic, what the region realized is the risk that the sector faces from its the regular trend, and mainly the risk like the concentration of the source market majorly to Asia, predominance of air travel as a mode of transport, and domestic travel is not adequate from the revenue perspective. So going forward, we will expect ASEAN regional cooperation in the tourism sector to focus on few areas, like the countries will feel greater necessity to adoption of technology to track the tourist traffic in popular destination, or increase cross-border information exchange over, say, vaccine or testing to safely promote tourism activities. It may also decide to work together in, say, data gathering. And by this, I mean, COVID-19 has brought to the fore the vulnerability of the entire value chain of the tourism industry, and which spreads from domestic economy to the distribution network and the destination countries. So it made the role of data in the policy making has grown up in the ASEAN countries. The countries may also work for sustainable tourism, and by this I mean that the governments may come up with new tourism product or, say, policies to divert visitors from popular destinations to more inclusive outcome for, say, involving the local communities. So on my next slides, and yeah, so in conclusion, what I will say that COVID-19 has increased the need for cooperation. ASEAN has realized the importance of cooperation. They have worked with each other for very long. Much beyond 2002, they have been working together with each other since the early 1990s, particularly for the economic cooperation. The countries know each other's differences, and I think for the past 2-3 decades, they have learned to accommodate each other's requests to some extent. This may, of course, slow down ASEAN processes, and as we move towards more complicated topic like technology, data flow, we will see the ASEAN integration process slowing down further. But I think being a follower of ASEAN for very long, I must say that I have learned to live with it. ASEAN will have deeper integration in few areas compared to others. I think I said that earlier also. And trade and investment will be the core interest, while cooperation in digital areas to promote trade and investment will grow. So that's the advancement ASEAN will do from, say, 90s to 2000 to now. ASEAN will remain a neutral body that follows a consensus decision-making process. It doesn't want, or it doesn't aspire to be part of the conflict among the major economies in the world. ASEAN realizes its strength in economic integration, even though observers see risk of ASEAN members getting drawn to ideas of, say, US or the PRC, the members see its own benefit being engaged with both the economies. So now we have the RCEP. It's led by ASEAN and it is now effective. Few of the ASEAN members are also part of CPTPP, and this is again seen by many as something dividing ASEAN. But if I put my argument, I will say ASEAN members for long have decided that while some initiatives building on ASEAN economic community will be for all the 10 members, there are some members who are more advanced in terms of their economies, and they can go ahead and join bilateral or other regional trade agreements. So what ASEAN may need at this juncture is strong leadership to put forth the grouping strategic interest for being together, handle intra-ASEAN differences by streamlining ASEAN documents, generating greater understanding of what the organization intends to do and why. And because regional integration itself is a two-step process, that the benefits from the regional integration will only result when countries undertake the domestic reform or harmonize regulations across border. So ASEAN countries need to come up with this greater understanding of regional integration, and while continuing to work with all the big economies. So I will stop there. Thank you. Over to you, Suyat.
Welcome to session 2 of today's workshop. Session 2 is on Beyond RCEP and CPTPP towards further regional economic integration. My name is Eunice Huang, and I am an adjunct fellow with the RSIS. And in the day, my day job is running Google's trade policy work in the Asia Pacific region. So this is a topic that's very close to my heart. Today, we are very privileged to have 3 very, very established and renowned panelists with us to discuss this very important topic. I think there's been a lot of interest in regional trade agreements, especially with the movement towards the end of last year with CPTPP and the renewed interest in that, and also the coming into force of RCEP on the 1st of January this year. So today, I just want to dive right in and introduce the panelists that we have. The way we're structuring this is we're going to have 3 presentations, and then we're going to have a session of Q&A where you're free to pose any questions that you may have in the chat box. If you have specific questions for specific panelists, please do indicate so that we can direct the questions accordingly. But if it's just a general question, that's fine too, and we'll hear from the different panelists. So without further ado, let's dive in. The first speaker that we have today is PT Sri Sangnam. He is director of the ASEAN Studies Center at Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok, Thailand, and this is a position that he has held since 2013. He holds a PhD degree in economics from the University of Melbourne, and a MA degree in International Economics and Finance from Chulalongkorn University. He has also been teaching International Economics and Microeconomics for bachelor and master degree students at Chulalongkorn University since 2002. So without further ado, I'd like to hand the floor over to PT. I think he has some slides and he will be presenting his thoughts on this topic. PT, please.
Thank you very much. Good morning and sawadee krap. Let me start by thank you GRIPS and ISIS Singapore that organized these very good sessions, and thank you for inviting me to take part in these prestige sessions with the renowned scholars. So today's topic is about the Beyond RCEP and the CPTPP towards the further regional economic integrations. Let me start by presenting my outline. Today I will present to you 3 topics, but these 3 topics will be concluded into one word, which is RCEP, equivalent to opportunities. I think the RCEP, or the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnerships, is the opportunities for 15 countries in Southeast Asia, East Asia, and Oceania to strengthen the regional value chain to support the recovery of the global value chains. Then the second topic is about the this RCEP will create an opportunities for ASEAN and our dialogue partners to be part of this recovery GVC. And last but not least, I think RCEP is the good opportunities, is the good starting point for preparing ASEAN countries for a further complicated trade negotiations, especially CPTPP in the near futures. So I think I will start with this diagram. You see, I think nowadays, take part in global value chain is the thing that most of the countries would like very much to participate, because according to the studies by World Bank, take part in global value chain will create economic growth, will create a better employment opportunities, and last but not least, reduce poverty. And this is the flows of global value chains from before COVID-19 and prepare to the post-COVID-19. Global value chain will recover to the same value at the 18 trillion US dollars again by 2023, according to the estimations by Boston consultant groups. And they collected the data from trade finance model, UNCTAD, UN Comtrade, OECD, World Economic Forum, and so many organizations. The green lines represent the trade flows that is increased significantly throughout the periods, while the red line present the contractions volume of trades during this period, okay? And the black line is insignificantly changed in terms of like the value of international trades among the parties. And as you can see, the global value chain will did already recover since 2021, I mean the last quarters of the 2021, and will go up throughout this year, 2022 and 2023, to reach the same amount. But the look of the global value chain is totally, completely changed. And of course, this confirmed the thing we call decoupling, right? Because the recovery of this global value chain will separate the global value chain into two big regional value chains. The regional value chain in the Western countries, led by US and European Union, and the Asian regional value chains. As you can see, we have a very, very big line, big red line that link US and China, as well as EU and China. So that means trade war is still there. For the next 2 years, no American firms, no European firm would like to invest in China. And at the same time, Chinese investors also don't want to invest in China because produced in China cannot export easily to EU and US. They need the third party. The third party to use this production base to get access to a bigger market, China, EU, and US. And it seems like all business people and economists agree that ASEAN seems to be the locomotive of this recovery of the global value chains. Hence, the RCEP will help us, because this is the only, I can say, higher standards and more comprehensive FTA that the whole regional value chains of Asia integrate into the global value chains, right? Because RCEP cover not more than just the traditional FTA, but we also talk about the issues of like e-commerce, trade in services, intellectual property rights, and so many new standards. RCEP, I think you guys already know, that was concluded by the 2019. Unfortunately, India still cannot participate after a very, very long round of negotiations. Nowadays, RCEP can be considered as the largest free trade agreement in the world, comprised of about 1/3 of the global GDP and 1/3 of the world populations, with 15 member states, ASEAN 10, plus Japan, Korea, China, Australia, and New Zealand. And this is the 20 chapters of the RCEP. And this is among the very, very first agreement trade deals that most of the ASEAN countries join in new aspects, such as government procurements, promotions of small and medium-sized enterprises, talk about competitions, talk about e-commerce, talk about the protections of intellectual properties, as well as more open in terms of trade in services, as well as the movement of natural persons. So these highlight the yellow color is the new issues that is more comprehensive and higher standard for most of the Southeast Asian nations that we participate in RCEP. RCEP is, of course, will provide us a tariff eliminations for about 92% of good trades among RCEP countries. There will be more transparency in terms of the implementations of the non-tariff measures. The rule of origins will benefit countries like Thailand a lot because we cannot produce things from raw material to final product, but we use so many parts from our regional value chains, including the EEE sectors, electronic equipment and electrical appliance, automobiles and parts, chemical and plastics. Thailand can combine these rule of origins and export with a special privilege under RCEP to our most important trade partners, as well as the custom procedures and trade facilitations. You know, Thailand and most of Southeast Asian nations, we export a lot of agricultural products and food products. And under the custom procedure and trade facilitations, Article 4 of the RCEP, the custom clearance process for this group of products will be within just a very, very short period of 6 hours. And for most of the traded goods, it will be past all the custom clearance within the 48 hours. This is very, very good. As well as the trade in services, at least more than 2/3 of the RCEP service sectors will be fully open in the next period of times. For the investments, we also talk a lot more about investment state dispute settlements, because nowadays countries like Thailand have a larger number of the value of foreign direct investment outflow. We invest a lot in Southeast Asia, and we also hope very much that the e-commerce, you know, for most of the Southeast Asian nations, among top 10 of the total volume of trades, cross-border e-commerce seems to be a very, very huge share in this top 10 value of trades. Hence, we would like very much to see a more online personal information protections, transparencies, paperless trading, and of course, the other type of trade facilitations over the cyberspace. For intellectual property rights, competitions, and government procurement, this is a very, very new area that most of the ASEAN countries never participate before. Hence, this will rise up, this will raise our bar, this will create a higher standard for ASEAN in order to take part in these global value chains. And it was assigned last 2 years, and now it was fully implemented. Compared to other FTA 2.0, as you can see from this diagram, RCEP seems to be more user-friendly because it will not touch much up on the issues that is more complicated, such as TRIP+, especially on patent linkages, patent term exclusion, patent term extensions, data exclusivities. These 3 issues is not included in RCEP. That's why negotiating in RCEP and implementing in RCEP it's more easier and more convenient, and it's a very, very good starting point for ASEAN. It's more like a baby swimming pool for us to learn how to swim before we go to an open ocean, such as the agreements of the CPTPP, which talk more about patent linkages, while the FTA with EU talk more about patent term extensions, data exclusivities. This is also included in the EFTA, European Free Trade Association as well. There will be another new standards that we have to prepare ourselves for comply, especially for the countries that have a very, very big agricultural sectors, such as the International Union for Protections of the New Variety of Plants, or UPOV 1991. In RCEP, we don't mention much. We don't mention at all about the implementations of the UPOV 1991. But other trade deals, I mean, the FTA 2.0, more comprehensive, higher standards, all of these trade deals focus a lot on this UPOV 1991, including the CPTPP, USMCA, trade deal with EU, EFTA, and EAEU. So this is a thing that if we would like to go beyond the RCEP, we may need to think more. In terms of government procurement as well, RCEP is more like a starting point to introduce us to a more complicated versions of the government procurement agreements. But after we learn about this, I think it's a good opportunity for us to adapt ourselves, especially to have a more transparency government procurement, to join CPTPP, USMCA, EU, EFTA, and EAEU, as well as the standards of the labor, the compliance with international labor organizations, such as the establishments of the associations and rights. And of course, another big issue that is also concerned a lot in Southeast Asia, especially the countries that have a very, very strong government, as well as China, is the issues on the state-owned enterprise. The new kind of trade deals, not RCEP, but most of the new kind of trade deals focus more on how to let state-owned enterprise act in accordance with commercial considerations. So as I told you earlier, RCEP is the opportunity for us to join the recovery global value chain. And at the same time, this is the forum that prepare us to a more comprehensive and higher standard FTA in the future. So for the status of Thailand right now, and I think most of the ASEAN countries, since we see a decoupling, Western Bloc and Asian Bloc regional value chain that combine into global value chains. All countries, especially in Southeast Asia, would like very much to be a, connecting point to connect these two regional value chains together. And the tools, the main tools, in order to allow us, Thailand, to be that connecting point, we put a very, very high hope on negotiating an FTA. Now, Thailand have 38 FTA at hand. 14 is under consultations and studies. 9 already negotiates. The newest one is ASEAN Canada. And we have 14 signed and ineffective FTA. This allow Thailand to do trade without tariff, without non-tariff measure with 18 custom territories. But of course, compared to the best practice in Southeast Asia, Thailand is not at the front line because we cannot compare to Singapore and we cannot also compare to Vietnam. Vietnam, it's more like a rising star, and we in Thailand compare a lot with Vietnam because now Vietnam have about the same number of the signed FTA that already implemented and ineffective, 13 FTA. But Vietnam can do trade with 53 custom territories around the world without tariff, without non-tariff measures. Hence, Vietnam can position itself as the interconnected link to link the global value chains. And this is the thing that we may need to learn more from our neighboring countries. And we also would like very much that it will be better if we cannot position only Thailand to be that part, but how about ASEAN as a whole? How about ASEAN Production Network as the middleman between Asian regional value chains and Western global regional value chains? So in order to have a trade deal with countries like in other part of the world, especially in North America and South America, we may have to consider more about negotiations and joining the CPTPP. Unfortunately, some of the issues, the bold fonts in these 30 chapters of the CPTPP agreement in this slide is a little bit challenge for us because it is, like I told you earlier, higher standards, more comprehensive, more complicated. So we have to learn, maybe slowly, but we learn a lot from RCEP. And we would like very much to continue the same mechanism in order to, join CPTPP and other trade deals. There's a questions as well from the organizer to me about India. I think now India still has a significant outstanding issues that still remain unsolved to join RCEP. But of course, for the past 15 years, RCEP, India take part and very, very active in negotiations process. But until now, this is the unresolved issues in India. First, RCEP talk since early 2000 decades. But the government right now, BJP government, just become the government in 2014. Hence, they still don't agree on the issues of base here because they think, oh, I'm the new guys, just have an executive level and admin India in 2014. How come we have to accept the thing that was deal before us? They also don't agree on the so-called auto trigger safeguards. They would like very much to issue auto trigger safeguard without noticing to other countries. They don't agree with Russian obligations. They need to reserve the right in order to keep in tariff rates and all non-tariff measures back again. They also don't trust countries like China in the issues of data localizations. And of course, the biggest issues, it's most of the business people as well as individual people in India still see trade deficit as a negative force. They don't want any minus sign in their trade balance, especially in these four main sectors: milk and dairy products, automotive industry, textile and apparel, as well as iron, steel, and products. And of course, India is also never trust this mechanism because they also see the interventions of the superpower in other aspects apart from international trade and investment. Hence, in conclusion, I think for me, RCEP is still the opportunity because this is the opportunity to strengthen the regional value chain to support the recovery, but decoupling of the global value chains. RCEP is the opportunity for ASEAN and dialogue partners, including India. Of course, we have a special rights for India. If India ready and would like to join us, no more negotiations, they can just implement it. So India will be a group, and we would like very much to bring India into this process. And last but not least, RCEP is a good starting point for preparing member countries for such a more complicated trade negotiations, include CPTPP, and of course we talk more about FTAAP under the APEC forum. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, PT. That was very, very interesting. I really liked your analogy of the baby swimming pool. I think it's a really accurate depiction of RCEP about learning how to swim before going into the ocean, the big open ocean. I think there are probably a lot of questions that people have from your presentation, and we can take them on during the Q&A session. So let me just move on to the next speaker. Next speaker is Professor Shujiro Urata, who is Professor Emeritus of Waseda University. He was Professor of International Economics of the Graduate School of Asia Pacific Studies in Waseda University. He is also currently a Faculty Fellow at the Research Institute of Economy, Trade and Industry, RIETI, Specially Appointed Fellow at the Japanese Center for Economic Research, Senior Research Advisor of the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia area, Visiting Fellow at the Asian Development Bank Institute, and Distinguished Senior Fellow at the Institute of Developing Economies. Professor Urata received his bachelor's in economics from Keio University, an MA and PhD in economics from Stanford University. So without further ado, I'll pass the floor over to Professor Urata, please. Professor, I think you might be on mute.
Okay.
Okay.
Can you hear me now? Okay. I was going to say I'd like to thank the chair lady to introduce me, and then I'd like to thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity to talk about the issues of my interest and issues of my very importance. What I listened to Dr. PT's presentation with a lot of interest, and I was kind of concerned that what I'm going to say is very much what he said, but I tried to maybe introduce some new information in addition to maybe repeating of what Dr. Pitti said earlier. So what I like to do is to talk about the first kind of historical developments leading up to two mega FTAs, RCEP and CPTPP. And then I now turn to the achievements of what the RCEP and CPTPP has done. And then I talk about the challenges. And then after that, I'll talk about the way toward FTAAP. Let's see. Oh, how do I? Oh, here. Okay. So I see the origin of RCEP goes back to maybe around 1990s, when many countries in the world were trying to form kind of regional economic cooperation, like say EU in North America, NAFTA was being discussed, and East Asia, Prime Minister Mahathir suggested the East Asia Economic Caucus. I think this is in response to movements toward regional economic integration in other parts of the world. And then ASEAN established after ASEAN Free Trade Area in 1992, and then not so much movement until the 1997-98, when Asian financial crisis hit the region. And in order to avoid a repetition of the Asian financial crisis, many countries in the region were eager to set up a kind of regional economic cooperation mechanism. One of the specific idea that they had was to form East Asia Free Trade Agreements, consisting of ASEAN +3, ASEAN plus China, Japan, Korea. And this was in early 2000s. ASEAN +3 or East Asia FTA was promoted very actively by China. And then Japan proposed ASEAN +6 framework, which is called CPIA. And feasibility studies went on until 2010, 2011, I think. And then China and Japan got together and to kind of submit the joint proposal to ASEAN +3 meetings. What that was the we should go ahead and say form East Asia regional framework, regardless of either ASEAN +3 or ASEAN +6. And then ASEAN came back with the idea of RCEP in 2011, I'm sorry. And then actual negotiation started in 2012 and then go on. And then during the process, as was pointed out by Dr. Pitti, India dropped out, but so remaining 15 countries enacted this RCEP, and that went into force this year. And looking at the other side of, well, the earlier development that I just described was what is happening in East Asia. When we look at the developments in Asia Pacific, it was, I think the beginning was 1989 when APEC was formed. And in 1994, Bogor Declaration was delivered, which is to establish free trade and investment environment in Asia Pacific. And this was a very interesting framework which calls for voluntary action. And voluntary action didn't really happen the way APEC members expected. So 4 countries got together and to form a free trade agreement, which was in 2006. Brunei, Chile, New Zealand, and Singapore formed P4, which later turned into TPP. And then in 2006, the United States proposed the idea of FTAAP, Free Trade Area of Asia Pacific, which includes all 21 APEC economies, member economies. And then in 2010, this is expanded TPP negotiation. The TPP negotiation started, I think it was 2008, with 4 countries, but in 2010, they decided to increase the issue, like financial services. And the United States was very interested in being included in this negotiation. And so US showed interest, and then other countries showed interest as well. In 2010, 8 countries got together and then started negotiation. And then later, 4 other countries, Malaysia, Canada, Mexico, and Japan, joined the negotiation. And then the negotiations are concluded in 2016, and the countries went into a ratification process, but the United States decided, well, this is President Trump decided to withdraw US from the TPP, and then remaining 11 countries got together and then set up the CPTPP, which went into force in 2018. So this is the very brief history of what happened in 2 kind of strands of the way to achieve, to try to establish, on the one hand, RCEP, on the other hand, CPTPP. One of the points I wanted to make is that it was a long history, almost 30 years that went into the formation of these 2 mega FTAs. And for RCEP, particularly ASEAN played a very important role. And ASEAN is called ASEAN Centrality. They had a very important position. They contributed a lot to the formation of the RCEP. Now, let me turn to achievements. Here, again, I'm afraid that what I'm going to talk about are very much what's being said already by Dr. Pitti. Here, before that, sorry, this is a map showing RCEP, CPTPP, and later I'd like to discuss that these 2 can be a very important pathways to FTAAP. And looking at the size of these 2 mega FTAs in terms of population, GDP, trade, percentage of the world, RCEP is huge compared to like CPTPP, like 30% population, GDP, and trade, whereas for CPTPP, it's significantly smaller. And later, I'd like to discuss that the FTAAP, which covers APEC economies, if that is established, it accounts for more than 60% of GDP, 50% of trade, and so on. So it's a very big, really mega FTA. Now, coming back to the achievements, here, this is same information, I think, which we heard already. What I did is the comparison of the provisions, issues, which are covered by RCEP, CPTPP, and WTO. So RCEP has a so-called WTO extra or WTO plus provisions. As you can see, e-commerce, competition policy, which are covered in RCEP but not in WTO. But comparison of CPTPP and RCEP tells us there are provisions which are covered by CPTPP but not by RCEP. State-owned enterprises, labor, environment, competitiveness and business facilitation, and so on. So comparison of CPTPP and RCEP indicate that in terms of comprehensiveness, the CPTPP is greater than RCEP. In terms of liberalization and trade and investment, here again, CPTPP is greater than RCEP. Level of commitment, CPTPP is greater than RCEP. But when it comes to economic cooperation, this is a very important part of RCEP because of the developing members, CLM to be precise, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar. These are the countries which receive special differential and special and differential treatment from the other members. So again, to help these countries to implement the commitments, economic cooperation plays a very important role in RCEP, whereas CPTPP, there's not such a provision. Now, and here, this shows the level of trade liberalization or commitment and tariff elimination commitment. If you compare here, I have so-called ASEAN plus 1 FTAs. This is ASEAN plus Australia, New Zealand, ASEAN plus China, ASEAN plus India, ASEAN plus Japan, ASEAN plus Korea. And then average of these ASEAN plus 1 FTAs. The numbers show the percentage of the tariff lines where zero tariff or no tariff will be applied at the end of the grace period. And this is RCEP, and this is the average of ASEAN plus 1. If you compare these two columns, you can see RCEP for some countries lower than the ASEAN plus 1, which are already implemented. See, so that really tells us RCEP has a lower level of tariff elimination. And of course, CPTPP, practically about 100% for all the members. So again, in terms of trade liberalization, RCEP has a lot of room for improvement. And that is part of the challenges that I have here. But first challenge is the implementation of the commitments. Of course, that has to be monitored, enforced, and that's not easy, and that has to be done. And the second challenge here I point out is to increase membership. CPTPP, we already have application from the UK, China, Taiwan, Taipei. And I understand that Thailand is interested in joining CPTPP. Korea showed interest, and so on. So it is very important to increase membership because the benefits of FTA comes from, well, has a lot to do with the number of members. The larger the membership, the larger the benefit that you can expect. So for CPTPP and also RCEP, we talked about India. Yes, India, it'll be in the interest of India, as far as I'm concerned, and for other members as well. Possible other countries include like Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, these South Asian countries. And then next challenge is the, yes, for RCEP, as we saw, there are several provisions which CPTPP had, but not RCEP. So RCEP needs to increase this coverage and also need to upgrade quality. I already talked about the level of trade liberalization. But there are many other areas where RCEP can improve. Now, finally, the road to FTAP. In 2010, APEC Leaders Summit in Yokohama, Japan, leaders agreed that there are three so-called pathways to establish FTAP, which is considered to be the goal or objective of regional economic integration in APEC area. So 3 pathways are ASEAN plus 3, ASEAN plus 6, and TPP. ASEAN plus 3, ASEAN plus 6 later turned into RCEP, and then TPP turned into CPTPP. And as we heard from Dr. Pitti, the level, and as I said, the level of commitment and the coverage of commitment is more limited for RCEP. So it's good to start with RCEP. Those who countries' economies which can join CPTPP can join CPTPP, but if they're not ready, they should try to improve their capability by using technical and economic assistance in the RCEP program, and then become CPTPP, and then CPTPP with increased membership, and which eventually covered 21 APEC economies, and possibly, non-economies like UK, maybe Colombia. So again, this is a possible way that the way toward the establishment of FTAP. Let me end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Urata, for the very detailed explanation of the 2 pathways. It's quite amazing that 30 years went into the formation of these 2 major agreements, and hopefully it will not take another 30 years before we get to the FTAP. We will save the questions for later during the Q&A. I have some questions myself, but without further delay, let me introduce the third speaker for today, and that's Jeffrey Wilson. Jeffrey Wilson is the research director at the Perth US Asia Center. He provides leadership and strategic direction in developing the center's research program across its publications, policy, and dialogue activities. Dr. Wilson specializes in the regional economic integration of the Indo-Pacific, and he has particular expertise in the politics of trade agreements, regional economic institutions, and Australia's economic ties with Asia. So I'm going to hand over the floor to Dr. Wilson. Please take it away. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Eunice, and thanks everyone for coming to join us for this really esteemed group today. Well, I don't have any slides. I would just like to talk to this group, and hopefully we can transition into discussion at the end of the presentations. But, following on those 2 very comprehensive presentations, I'd like to broaden things out a little bit to put the region in its global context. And I'd start by making the observation that regional economic integration in the Indo-Pacific is in surprisingly good health right now. As we've just discussed, we've got these 2 new and globally significant mega-regional trade agreements. RCEP, the world's largest regional trade bloc, which entered into force on the 1st of January, and the CPTPP, which after quiet operation for a couple of years, seems like it's about to enter an expansion phase with 5 potential new members lining up. So we've been never closer to getting to FTAP than we've been over the last 30 years, as Urata-san has explained. But I think that development's all the more surprising when we view it in the context of the global trade system challenges that we talked about in our panel earlier on today. We've seen a massive turn towards protectionism, a still unresolved US-China trade war, serious issues in the WTO's negotiation and disputes functions, and also the emergence of geopolitically driven coercive trade practices. So the Indo-Pacific is doing exceptionally well when we have a look out the window. But I think it would be a mistake to think that the region's trade future is safe or secure, because many of those threats facing the global trade system augur very poorly for a trade-exposed region like ours, and neither the CPTPP and or RCEP is properly going to offer protection. And so I'd like to argue that it's time that this region needs to take its demonstrated commitment to trade through these blocks global, so to speak, by advocating for the principles embedded in these mega-regional trade agreements into more global level trade and economic fora. The first point I'd like to make, and this is just to address a constant bugbear that annoys me for all my constant writing and commentary and advice on regional trade agreements, addresses this question of, is RCEP and the CPTPP, are they competing trade blocs? And the answer is decisively no. There is this common view out there that the two are competing models for the regional trade architecture, which is kind of, you can understand why people have this view because they've got different objectives, different memberships, different provisions. We might even say RCEP and CPTPP have different philosophies about where the trade system needs to go next. And it's also been contributed, this belief, by geopolitical conflict. Particularly discourses that RCEP is a China-led agreement or the TPP was a US attempt to contain China. And some of these ideas boil down into the view that we've got these two mega regional trade agreements and one of them has to be the model, but not both. The reality is they're actually extraordinarily complementary due to their different purposes. And I'd probably just draw attention to what I would argue were the three objectives of a major regional trade agreement, which would be liberalisation or reducing tariff barriers, harmonisation or getting everybody on a single regulatory framework, and the issue of new rulemaking, how we can go into what used to be called Singapore issues that we're now calling WTO+. RCEP's largely a harmonisation agreement, stitching up the ASEAN 5 and 6 ASEAN +1 FTAs into a single rate agreement. And that alone creates huge gains from trade. The benefits to companies in global value chains of having a single rules of origin regime alone are probably worth doing RCEP just for the ROOs chapter. Now, RCEP, as Urata-san's pointed out, is pretty weakly liberalising, but that's okay, because a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of tariff cutting was done in those prior bilaterals that have been folded into it. And then the CPTPP gives the regional rulemaking agreement, breaking new ground in a whole heap of WTO plus areas: investment, environment, e-commerce, IP services, financial services, telecoms, and many more. So we've got a fairly obvious and beneficial division of labour in the regional trade system here. Bilaterals over the last 20 years have done the heavy liberalisation work. RCEP then harmonises these into a cohesive block, and the CPTPP allows the more ambitious reform-ready members of the region to move forward with new rulemaking. That seems like a very nice set of trade architectures that all fit together. But I also think this good news, it needs to be tempered a little bit, because the global trade system, as we heard this morning, is in one of the worst crises in a generation. And a quick roundup of the problems lays the nature of the challenge for the region pretty bare. We've seen a global turn towards protectionism, surging rates. This is tracked very well by the Global Trade Alert database run out of St. Gallen. Go and have a look at their data. Every year since the GFC, protectionist measures have been higher and higher and higher, and they certainly accelerated dramatically in 2020 and 2021 as a result of COVID. We've had issues about the effective failure of WTO as its negotiating function. So no round since Uruguay, which is 25 years ago now. And even when we look at some sectoral agreements, progress isn't being made. The fishery subsidies agreement didn't get up just recently, and ongoing log jams in environmental goods and the dispute settlement reform process as well. There's also the challenge just for the WTO's enforcement function related to the long-standing disagreement over the appellate body, which for the last 2 years has led to the US vetoing new appointments to the AB. It's now in court, which has posed this appeal into the void, as it's called, problem, that if you lose a WTO dispute through panel, you can just lodge an appeal and that's the end of the matter. Whether countries choose to do this is obviously a political decision, but the reality is, in situations where trust and good faith aren't present, the WTO no longer has a functional enforcement mechanism while the AB is in court. I'd also add to the list the rise of coercive trade practices, and this is where governments are using trade barriers not for garden variety protectionism, but as a form of geopolitical punishment during diplomatic disputes. I'm sure everyone's read this because there's been a lot of focus on China, which has deployed this tactic by some counts against 9 countries, certainly in our region, Korea in 2017, Australia in 2020, and we see the Lithuania-EU dispute that's playing out right now. But I think it's important to remember that coercive trade practices are not simply a China thing. We also saw this extensively from the US under the Trump administration, where coercive or threatened trade coercive practices were widely used to bully other countries into making political or trade decisions. These kind of practices are in pretty flagrant breach of WTO rules, but are not easily addressed by any of the existing remedy systems. and they greatly dent global confidence that rules will be upheld. Now, this broader crisis in the global trading system is a serious problem for the Indo-Pacific. The region is highly trade integrated, which economically and developmentally has been an extraordinarily good thing, but it's also therefore, by corollary, highly trade exposed, which in a systemic trade system crisis is a very bad indeed. And the question we'd have to ask then is, can these two shiny new mega-regional trade agreements in the Indo-Pacific protect us from some of these global headwinds? And I suggest the answer is probably not, unfortunately. RCEP itself is little help for beyond the region trade problems. So its core strength is its inclusivity, that it finds a common landing point the entire region can get behind and sign up to. But this means it's not configured for projecting its provisions out globally. There's no extra regional members, nor clear pathway for them to join, and a comparatively low ambition on standards. CPTPP's problem is the reverse of RCEP, that it has a tight and exclusive, but also controversial membership. Its regional coverage remains patchy. Most of Southeast Asia is still outside CPTPP, as are for the time being China and Korea, notwithstanding their discussions towards accession. There are some serious political controversies over expansion, with dual membership applications coming from China and Taiwan, and questions from several countries in the region, including my own Australia, as to whether China's merit worthy of joining the CPTPP, given some of its coercive practices. And then there's also the vexing question of whether the United States would ever rejoin at some point, and do members need to keep the door open for the US in some way or other. So what this means is that CPTPP and RCEP are very good at solving intra-regional trade issues amongst ourselves. But for those extra-regional problems that we face, we need something more. And what I'd argue, in particular in the paper we'll be developing for this out of today, is that the next step for the region's trade agenda probably therefore lies not within, but without the region. Internally, the Indo-Pacific is in a good place. It's certainly doing better than any other region on trade terms around the world at the moment. And while there's still certainly a lot of progress to be made, which Kitty talked about with RCEP, and we've also mentioned issues about CPTPP expansion agenda, further countries in the region and their trade and economic interests within region trade agreements are going to offer fairly incremental gains. By contrast, the most significant thing we could do now is to try and articulate the values, but certainly principles, rules and provisions that we've developed outwards into the global system to try and buttress rules-based trade at a global level against some of these political headwinds. There's a lot of ways that we could do this, of course, but I've got three concrete ideas that I'll present here. The first would be that the region needs to articulate trade issues onto global forums. Many of these problems haven't been solved in trade-specific bodies like the WTO and Geneva, so it's time to take them to a higher political and diplomatic level. Some of the threats to the global trade system and what that will mean need to be put squarely on broader bodies. I'd probably identify the G7 in its plus formats, certainly the G20, East Asia Summit, APEC and the OECD. These above trade bodies need to say there is a problem in trade that we need to do something about. I also believe that governments from the region need to step up their advocacy on and involvement in the vexing question of WTO reform, particularly around disputes. And it's certainly tempting to view the dispute over the appellate body as an EU-US issue, which is largely how the competing proposals have been litigated so far. But the reality is, if this issue leaves the world trade system without a functioning umpire, it affects us all. It can't just be left to Brussels and Washington. And so regional governments could go beyond the general calls we've made for a timely and satisfactory resolution to the debate to directly petitioning these protagonists that this needs to be brought to an end. The AB needs to be restored and we need a functional dispute system that we can all have confidence in. And the third thing the region could do is get much more active in the emerging plurilateral negotiating space in Geneva. These plurilateral modalities where a subset of reform-ready WTO members negotiate in a specific sector are probably the future of global trade negotiations. And they're certainly where the 21st century rules of the road for digital and environment and services are going to be written. So Indo-Pacific governments therefore need to lean in hard to plurilateralism. environmental goods, e-commerce and services negotiation, as well as this question about carbon pricing and CBAMs are all key domains where the region needs to have a strong voice globally. To put that all together, what I'm trying to argue today is that the regional trade architecture is in surprisingly good health, but external crises emanating at the global level are casting a long shadow over the Indo-Pacific's economic future. And that means that having gotten our own regional house in pretty good order, it's time that we turn our attention to these global level challenges instead. Thank you all.
Good afternoon. Since President Trump launched the US-China trade war in 2018, the specter of a great power economic decoupling has loomed over global trade. This encompasses both overall trade volume to reduce economic dependence, as well as focus on the reduction of imports and the increase in investment in security-sensitive technologies, such as semiconductors and telecommunications. Such a decoupling could disrupt global supply chains by separating Chinese production capabilities from US-owned technologies, pose problems for the establishment of new production sites, and could potentially result in two competing markets as these powers seek to disentangle their supply chains. Our session this afternoon will discuss the strengthening of the resilience of supply chains in the wake of US-China rivalry. Our speakers are Professor Natasha Hamilton-Hart, the professor in the Department of Management and International Business, the University of Auckland, New Zealand, Professor Yasuyuki Todo, professor of the Graduate School of Economics at Waseda University and faculty fellow in the Research Institute of Economy, Trade and Industry of Japan, and Dr. Dipender Singh Ranwa, adjunct senior fellow at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies at Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. Without further ado, could I give the floor to Professor Hamilton-Hart?
Thank you very much indeed. If you give me just a moment, I will share my screen. Hopefully that's visible to you. Thank you very much, Professor Jessica, for that kind introduction. And my thanks also to the team at RSIS and GRIPS for the opportunity to join you today. I've enjoyed listening to the earlier presentations, and I feel it's wonderful to be sort of virtually connecting to Singapore from what is now known as the Hermit Kingdom of New Zealand. In this presentation, I want to put forward three observations. And one is to note that there is, in fact, some decoupling of supply chains driven by the US-China rivalry in the tech sector, although the extent is quite uneven and the trajectory is still unclear. The second is that to a certain extent, this decoupling is driven by security motives, and that when a security logic comes into play, we are facing something quite different from the economic logic of the supply chain revolution that really has driven regional integration over the last 30 years. So we're talking about a completely different mindset and a different calculus in which costs and benefits are weighed up. And the third point is to comment on the economic structure of regional trade, and I guess regional trade and production, which, despite the security concerns that might be visible, effectively reinforces an asymmetric interdependence centered on China. And that seems to be the most likely outcome of the current move towards partial decoupling and certainly increased US-China rivalry. So let me briefly try and make good on these 3 points. The first one is just to recap the events of the last 5 years, which have hogged the headlines and really marked quite a sea change in attitudes of both the US and China. The first decoupling driver that we can see is obviously the reciprocal tariffs that have been placed on each other's products, or a great percentage of them, that has seen the average US tariff on Chinese goods rise from what was a really low 3.1% to 19% as of a year ago. And also about a year ago, Chinese tariffs on about 60% of US shipments, which rose from about 8 to 21% or so. And the progress on resolving the tariff dispute remains quite unclear because China has not met its agreed buying targets on the phase 1 deal. And it's not quite clear how it would do that anyway, but it certainly hasn't. And it does not seem that raising the tariffs is imminent on either side. What is notable, though, is that despite these tariffs, the decline in US imports from China that we saw in 2019 and 2020 was actually reversed last year with this enormous pandemic-driven demand for consumer products seems to have largely driven that import surge. So you might say on the face of it, what decoupling, but largely this appears to be consumer goods, electronics, and there is scope still for certain kinds of decoupling to occur in the more high-tech sensitive areas, which I'll get to in a moment, which have been particularly targeted by US regulatory and legal moves quite separate from the tariff war, because if the objective of the tariff, tit-for-tat tariffs, is actually the opposite of decoupling. It is to bring the two economies closer together. Trump wanted to sell more stuff to China. The other moves that have more explicitly security motives aim at something quite different, which is actually to reduce exposure and dependence on China. So we saw an early move was the 2018 Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, which empowered this awful committee, CFIUS, to review potential proposed purchases of American companies by Chinese firms, and it started to block various acquisitions and to take action against other Chinese firms and effectively prohibit them from doing business in the US. The 2019 Defense Authorization Act consolidated this and effectively barred Huawei and ZTE and some other firms from doing business in the US. A longer list of Chinese entities have made their way onto the US entity list, which doesn't just target China, but I reviewed the latest iteration dated early February, and Chinese entities by far outnumber those of any other country as listed on this list. The last count that I saw in the press was that there were 77 Chinese entities. However, I counted a much longer number on this list. It depends a bit on how you count subsidiaries and so, but they certainly are targeting a large number of Chinese technology intensive firms with potential dual use or military or sensitive technologies. There's also another list, which is the unverified list, which just makes it procedurally more difficult for US companies to export or engage with Specification Act that was passed in the Senate in June last year and then followed up with the America Competes Act. So whether these actually get operationalized or not, but they're putting on the table a figure of about $250 billion US, which is intended to produce greater self-reliance and autonomy for the United States, including for manufacturing capacity, which has of course, the US has lost a lot of ground over the last 20 years in its ability to manufacture critical technology. So these are the US moves that are trying to bring that back home, or at least take it out of China. On the Chinese side, of course, they have a long-standing program to increase the indigenous capacity of their technology sector, including the higher tech advanced technologies that it currently still depends to some extent on foreigners. They've passed various parts of legislation, the cybersecurity law, 2019 policy to remove all foreign hardware and software from government computers. They have retaliated, or they have threatened to retaliate against foreign companies that comply with US directives, that they make them liable for action in Chinese courts. And of course, they have vigorously condemned each new US announcement that it is putting another company on the entity list, and they have denounced this. I think probably the most recent move they made was to they've had a security review of their own technological base, and published at the end of last year an export controls white paper, which on its content, at least the version I could read, is actually quite unexceptional. But it's the first time that the Chinese have publicly released such a white paper, setting out the potential controls that they can employ with respect to dual use or militarily sensitive technology. They talk about wanting to meet international standards and to do this cooperatively and responsibly. The security logic that I think we see on both sides is quite notable. It's no news to anyone here that, of course, there's been a huge escalation in threat perceptions on both sides. When in 2017, the US started talking about China quite openly as an adversary, and the Chinese economic model as a threat to not just US prosperity, but to US security as well. That marks a huge change in perceptions of China that had prevailed really from the Clinton era onwards, which basically saw more to gain from internationalizing China that would provide greater opportunities for economic prosperity for the US as well. And this perception of China as a rival and incipiently as a threat or an adversary seems to run across both parties. They can almost agree on nothing at all, but the US Innovation and Competition Act of last year passed the Senate with a strong majority. This seems to be the one thing that both sides of politics can agree on. On the Chinese side, they also have a rising concern with the potential vulnerability that occurs when there is interdependence. And obviously, having been targeted by US restrictions and seen some of their flagship firms such as Huawei targeted and suffer as a result of these targeted restrictions, the Chinese are very aware that they face some very significant vulnerabilities. They do not control the latest high-end chips that they need, and in various other selected areas, they are not fully, they don't have full indigenous capacity, and rely significantly on Taiwanese and Korean technology in particular, but a lot of that is also related to underlying US technology, which is now potentially, or in some cases, actually no longer available to them. So when they view things through a security lens, the normal economic calculation of costs and benefits, does it really make sense to decouple? Economically, it doesn't. And I think if you read the business press or you read a lot of the economics related literature, it's quite clear that this is illogical and self-defeating, and it either can't happen or it won't happen because it's too expensive and it's more or less impossible to reverse the complex interdependence. But if you view things through a security lens, what matters is the relative distribution of gains and capacities, and the economic costs are not irrelevant, but they are of a different order. Sorry, let me just go back. Where are we? I will point out, of course, that what Asia has seen over the last 3 decades of rising prosperity has been, security has really been set aside. We haven't seen a security logic brought to regional trade negotiations or regional investment policies. Instead, we have seen a completely economics-driven integration process, which could be called the supply chain or the global value chain revolution, which has seen the fragmentation of production across national boundaries, and the emergence of what is often called complex interdependence. And this logic is based on economies of scale, gains from specialization, gains from agglomeration and co-location. And that has really seen a relentless focus on efficiency with, different parts and components of products being distributed according to this economic logic, and not at all according to the political logic or security concerns. And this has what has given us not just a great deal of regional prosperity, but also has seen China emerge as the preeminent source of certain kinds of manufactured products. In terms of the actual degree of shifts that we have seen as a result of the security-driven restrictions on technology firms in particular, there are, of course, other drivers. Rising labor costs in China, pandemic-driven, new concerns about just overly long and complex supply chains might be driving some of the relocation. But it's quite clear from even the statements of some key technology players that they are, of course, affected by the new atmosphere of suspicion and restrictions between the US and China. So Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing, Hon Hai, Delta Electronics have all announced that they have already or are projecting to relocate or invest in significant new production capacity outside of China, in India, in Japan, in the US. And they have more or less said that this is because of the US and all the Chinese restrictions that they are facing. And so at the moment, we haven't seen the full force of some of these restrictions. We've seen certain firms definitely suffer a cutoff, such as Huawei lost its #1 spot in mobile phones in China because it was not able to actually bring new products to market because it was cut off from some critical supplies. So paradoxically, this has seen Apple emerge last year as the largest smartphone seller in China. But we have, Huawei's revenues were down 30% last year, and it is investing enormously in more autonomous capacity. China has put an enormous amount of resource behind the development of more advanced semiconductor manufacturing capacity in order to reduce the vulnerability that they're now experiencing. So we are definitely seeing some moves to try, both at the firm level in response to government policy, as well as government policies to invest in greater autonomous capacity. In other respects, there's a lot of business. As I said, the actual trade volume is still high, and lots of firms are still investing in China, particularly if they sell to the Chinese market. Let me just finally touch on the emerging structure of regional trade. I said at the beginning that I think that what we're seeing is the emergence of an increasingly Sino-centric, regionally integrated market, and that this trend, despite the security disruption, is that it seems to be that companies and economies in East Asia will largely be drawn into the Chinese orbit because they face lower barriers to trade, because the relative market growth in China exceeds that of the US, and it's not clear that with all this new investment in US capacity that they're actually going to be able to resolve their long-standing problems, economic problems, for actually delivering a higher trajectory of growth and innovation. Chinese dual circulation policy is not one of isolation. It is actually based on the idea that you will draw foreign market players into your orbit. And of course, regional trade agreements that we've heard so much about today actually directly or indirectly are likely to have the effects of reinforcing economic ties with China. And that for most countries in the region, this will be quite asymmetric because they rely on China more than the other way around. So apologies for going slightly over time. I will stop here. So.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Hamilton Hart. Could I now give the floor to our next speaker, Professor Yasuyuki Todo.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, then let me share my slide. Can you see the slides?
Yes.
Okay. First of all, I'd like to thank the workshop organizers for inviting me to this great conference, great workshop. I have already learned a lot from previous presentations, and I'm going to talk about resilient and innovative supply chains. And what I'm going to talk about is pretty much overlapped with what Professor Hamilton-Hart has already explained. But I'd like to provide some conceptual considerations and some more data and some policy suggestions. First, everybody has already confirmed that risks of supply chains have already been recognized because of COVID-19 and the US-China decoupling. This map is showing that in April and May 2020, many automobile factories in Japan, like Honda, Nissan, and Toyota, stopped operation because of shortage of supplies from China. And it has actually been evidenced that such negative economic shocks propagate through supply chains, particularly from the experience of the Great East Japan earthquake. These maps are taken from one of my studies, showing that on the day of the earthquake, many factories in the affected area reduced the production drastically. But then 20 days later, many factories outside the affected area also reduced production very much due to the supply chain disruptions. And the indirect loss due to the propagation effect was 100 times as large as the direct production loss. So we shouldn't underestimate the propagation effect. But this propagation effect can be is actually found to be affected by input substitutability of suppliers. So our simulation shows that when input substitutability is complete, very easy, then the propagation effect is negligible. But if it is very difficult to substitute suppliers, then the propagation effect can be large and long-lasting. And also, this study shows that this study is using firm-level data for global supply chains. And then I estimated the effects of supply chain links with a firm damaged by Hurricane Sandy in the US on sales growth. Then I found that the US firms linked with a firm in the damaged area reduced sales after the hurricane very much. But firms outside the US linked with a firm in the damaged area did not reduce sales after the hurricane. Moreover, firms US firms linked with a firm in the damaged area, but also linked with foreign partners, did not reduce sales as much as other US firms. So these findings suggest that globalized firms could mitigate the propagation of negative shocks through supply chains. This is possibly because these globalized firms, for these globalized firms, substitution of suppliers and customers is relatively easy because they can utilize their large number of supply chain partners as substitute, and also they can utilize their large information network across countries. So these findings suggest that geographically diversified supply chain networks are the key to the resilience of supply chains. And in addition, I found that geographically diversified supply chains are more innovative. So this study is using firm level data for Japan and then found that sales and sales per worker of firms linked with distant suppliers are growing faster than firms linked with only neighboring suppliers. So geographic diversity is also found to be productivity promoting. And in addition to supply chains, recently, research collaboration networks of firms are also proliferating across countries, as this figure shows. And then I found that international research collaboration is actually quite effective to promote innovation. Here, I estimated the effect of international collaboration and domestic collaboration on the number of patent citations, which is a measure of the quality of innovation. And then I found the effect of international collaboration is quite large and much larger than the effect of domestic collaboration for all countries, particularly for China, actually. So these findings suggest that geographically diversified supply chains and innovation networks are resilient and innovative. Okay, so then now let's look at the policies and trends in global supply chains recently. So this part is already explained by Natasha, so I skip this. But I'd like to focus. I'd like to emphasize that recently the governments of Japan, the US, European countries are targeting resilience of supply chains, particularly those in the semiconductor industry, by reshoring of plants to the domestic economy using huge subsidies and by supporting R&D in high-tech sectors. However, despite of these policies, the trade between the US and China is actually increasing, as we have already seen throughout this workshop. So particularly after the COVID-19, both exports from China to the US, exports from the US to China are increasing. And if you look at more disaggregated product categories, you can see that, for example, exports of electrical machinery and equipment and parts from the US to China are actually increasing very much. And exports of precision instruments and parts are kind of stable. However, exports of aircraft and spacecraft and parts are declining over time during the after the initiation of the US-China decoupling policies. So you can see that only limited products, exports of only limited products, particularly very sensitive products to security, are declining. This figure is looking at more disaggregated products related to semiconductor. And you can see that these are not declining. This is actually increasing. But some are declining, like machine tools, including those for dry etching patterns on semiconductor materials, sound reproducing apparatus, including that using semiconductor media, so forth. So very much limited products are affected by the decoupling policies. Now let's look at the exports from Japan to China. Again, we can see that the exports of electrical machinery is very much increasing during the pandemic. Automobile, stable. Precision machinery, also stable. And this is a figure for disaggregated products related to semiconductor, mostly stable or actually increasing a little bit over time. So, so this is what's going on in trade. Now, because in the first part of this presentation, I emphasize the importance of geographic diversity of supply chains, let's look at the degree of concentration of partners in intermediate good imports measured by this HHI, Herfindahl-Hirschman index. So if this is high, this means that partners are concentrated or not diversified. So there you can see that the HHI of South Korea, Indonesia, Australia are increasing very much for the last 10 years. And this is mostly because of the increase in their reliance on China. So this figure shows the share of China in intermediate good imports. But at the same time, China itself actually reduced its HHI drastically for the last 20 years. That means that China successfully diversified its partners geographically, while other countries are increasing reliance on China. And let's look at Singapore. Singapore reduced its HHI from 2000 to 2010. And since then, it's kind of stable or a little bit increasing at the moderate level. It's actually decreasing here because Singapore declined its reliance on Japan. This is a bit unfortunate from the perspective of Japan, but very good from the perspective of diversification. Now let's focus on Japan and the US. Japan's HHI is actually decreasing from 2015, a few years before the US-China decoupling policies and the COVID-19 pandemic. And US declined from 2018. So this is obviously because of US decoupling policies, but this reduction for Japan may be explained by private companies' decisions to diversify their supply chains, as emphasized by some previous presentations. And this coincides with the reduction in the share of China. So these facts can be summarized, can provide some implications like this. First, supply chain diversity is too low for some Asia-Pacific countries, such as South Korea, Australia, Indonesia, and Japan. Second, recent policies of Japan and the US are successful in increasing supply chain diversity while not decreasing overall trade with China. However, there's still a room for Japan to increase supply chain diversity further because still Japan's HHI is kind of in the middle, much larger than these countries, China, US, and Singapore. Okay, so based on these conceptual considerations and facts, I would like to provide some policy suggestions. First, policies should not focus too much on reshoring to the domestic economy, but should focus more on diversification of supply chains across countries. And it can be done by policies supporting information sharing and business matching to lower search costs, particularly to small and medium enterprises. And it is also possible by effectively using international frameworks such as CPTPP, Quad, and FOIP. Second, policies should not focus too much on the semiconductor industry, but should cover broad industries. Because industry policy targeting limited industries has been found to be unsuccessful, particularly when combined with protectionism policies. So narrowly defined industry policy should be avoided. Third, policies should promote international knowledge networks. Actually, it is already incorporated in current policies to some current policies of Japan, the US, and European countries to some extent, but they are emphasizing more on supply chains, transactions of goods. But innovation is the ultimate source of competitiveness and economic growth. Promoting international knowledge network should be emphasized much more. And it is possible by, again, effectively utilizing international frameworks such as CPTPP, Quad, and FOIP. Finally, we should set up international rules to alleviate risks associated with national security concerns. Currently, private firms are facing risks of new restrictions on trade, technology transfer, and investment. To alleviate these risks, a new list of products and industries for possible further restrictions should be clearly defined by, for example, the WTO, or if the WTO is not working well, as mentioned earlier, by any other international framework, such as FOIP, or possibly CPP or RCEP, RCEP. But if the US is not joining this framework, maybe these rules may not work well. Okay, I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Todo. Could I now give the floor to Dr. Ranwa, please?
Thank you very much, Ambassador Dester. And my thanks to the organizers for inviting me to this workshop. It's been an outstanding one thus far. I've certainly learned a great deal, including from the two presentations in this session. And it's indeed a difficult act to follow, two distinguished researchers. There's little on the effects of the trade war and the pandemic on value chains. The pandemic in particular, that Professor Hamilton-Hart and Professor Todo have left unsaid. I'll take the liberty of looking at ASEAN's perspective at the opportunities that lie in a growing area, namely the servicification of manufacturing, and contend that to maintain and enhance its attractiveness and meet the challenges that lie ahead, ASEAN needs to scale up and carry out coordinated reforms. There are 3 points that summarize what I wish to say. Firstly, that instability in global value chains is likely to continue. A point has been reiterated earlier. And this instability is not just on account of the US-China trade dispute that shows no sign of abating in the near future, or the lingering effects of the pandemic. ASEAN's faced with other serious challenges in the near future. Secondly, the servicification of manufacturing, or in more colloquial terms, how services constitute an increasing share of value added in value chains, is growing at an accelerating pace and will continue to do so in new and unanticipated directions. I'm happy to give examples of this during the discussion. ASEAN's record, however, on liberalizing services leaves much to be desired, which brings me to the third point. What can ASEAN do to boost its attractiveness and relevance as a region? Finally, third point, ASEAN stands at the threshold of major changes. Beyond the pandemic and the trade dispute, it confronts the risks of climate change and the proliferation of technologies of the fourth industrial revolution. And unless the grouping takes concrete measures to adapt and capitalize on these changes, ASEAN risks eroding its attractiveness as an investment destination. And there are a number of initiatives it can take here. So just a few words on the backdrop. The pandemic, as we learned, has struck sharp flows to value chains, triggered by labor shortages at ports, localized shutdowns in manufacturing centers, logistical constraints that persist to the day, imbalances that cropped up in ways that could not have been anticipated in any risk management calculus as economies seek to open. Aside from being left behind in the quest for technologies of the fourth industrial revolution, companies are gradually facing up to the increasing likelihood of weather-induced disruptions. The rise in the incidence of floods, fires, storms, and other climate-induced disasters, which have had a direct bearing on critical inputs in supply chains, in Thailand and Texas in the Midwest, in the United States, in Germany recently, the Netherlands, the United Kingdom more recently in Malaysia, amongst a number of other examples, is forcing companies to rethink their investment strategies. All of these issues underline the need for a reconsideration of the approach to risk management and the imperative of developing value chains that are less stretched and fragile, or conversely resilient. So one of the questions that was posed by the organizers is how have or will regional economies be affected by possible US decoupling? There's little I can add to what's already been said. But what we tend to overlook is, from ASEAN's perspective, is that ASEAN is not there for the picking. Or more pertinently, Southeast Asia has grown into an increasingly prominent economic region with agency in terms of production, innovation, and increasingly competitiveness and purchasing power. And for a start, RCEP offers ASEAN an opportunity to deepen its links further with Japan and Korea, as well as Oceania. And ASEAN states individually and collectively will continue to seek new arrangements and deepen existing ones. The world, of course, is not static. Technological change today is diffusing rapidly across economies as multinational corporations fine-tune strategies. So we are beginning to observe some distinct trends. Firstly, in response to the trade dispute, those producing for the Chinese market will continue, of course, producing in China, but production for markets outside China is increasingly shifting to locations elsewhere. And ASEAN has seized opportunities here and will continue to do so as well. Secondly, value chains are shortening. And thirdly, new technologies are allowing firms to set up lower cost factories, even remotely. So as for ASEAN, it cannot afford to be sanguine about its prospects in the current environment. The uncertainties mentioned above remain pervasive. There's little that business dislikes more than uncertainty in the economic environment, and investors can and do vote with their feet. And one of those antidotes to those uncertainties is enhancing competitive potential through technology, deregulation, or both. And this is where servicification of manufacturing can play a vital role in imparting momentum to ASEAN. So servicification of manufacturing, or the deployment, increasing deployment of services in manufacturing, has grown at an accelerating pace over the past decade and a half, with trade and total value added in services growing at much faster rate than trade in goods. So beyond traditional services such as marketing and finance and accounting, these include logistics, distribution services, digital services, such as those we access every day over our smartphones. And research has shown that servicification boosts efficiency and competitiveness through increased labor productivity and helping growth. The benefits are manifold for infrastructure, education, technological diffusion, and spread out over a growing number of sectors. Even though it's more costly to trade in services than goods, the differential has been narrowing over time. And with reform, it can significantly shape the choices of relocating operations. The other aspect that we need to bear in mind is technology is integral to trade and services. Digitalization has facilitated an increase in services contribution to value added across multiple sectors. And these changes are reflected in a number of ways. Firstly, complete outsourcing of production, as you can see in the case of Apple products. Secondly, catering to customer demands and shifting preferences. And that's evident with smartphones, a telco company bundling services with the sale of the phone. And thirdly, the necessity of coordinating production across multiple locations. And this alludes to what Professor Toro also mentioned about diversifying geographically. And this is becoming, in the high-tech sector, increasingly commonplace. For instance, smart factories with increasing automation and use of robots, 3D printing. And there are some fascinating examples in Southeast Asia of this already having happened. So how can ASEAN nurture services to respond to these challenges and risks? to its standing as a preeminent and stable investment location. So many of the challenges that ASEAN faces today, such as climate change, the lingering risk of another pandemic, threat of proliferations of technologies of the fourth industrial revolution, all of these require cross-border solutions. So despite its modest record on economic integration, it's encouraging to note that when push comes to shove, ASEAN has responded to past crises with reforms, if not through direct coordination, by discussing policy responses and mutual learning. Excuse me. So the 1997 Asian financial crisis, the SARS epidemic, the global financial crisis are all instructive in this context. The current set of challenges, however, requires substantially greater coordination than what ASEAN has achieved thus far. There's also, I believe, an increasing realization across several ASEAN capitals that in order to maintain its standing as a resilient, stable investment destination, it needs to achieve far greater meaningful coordination than it has in the past. And coordinated reforms in the services sector do indeed have substantial potential in the quest for imparting resilience to value chains. So despite external liberalization in trade and commodities, with the exception of Singapore, ASEAN continues to pursue restrictive policies in trade and services. And this is fairly vividly reflected in the Services Trade Restrictiveness Index, STRI, which is compiled by the WTO. These restrictions in the form of higher taxes or outright prohibition or limits on the entry of foreign service providers detract from overall efficiency and impair competitiveness. The ASEAN Agreement on Trade and Services, or TISA for short, does provide a launch pad. However, to impart resilience to the region, ASEAN member states, especially the ASEAN 6 comprising the Region 5, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore, and Thailand, as well as Vietnam, countries that are to varying degrees embedded in global manufacturing chains, need to boost coordination beyond what the grouping has done thus far and execute tangible reforms. Some of these are low-hanging fruits, others call for a considerably greater degree of coordination. The universal desire among businesses located in Southeast Asia for greater regional integration, including lower barriers to intra-ASEAN trade in goods as well as services, speaks a great deal to this context. So what can ASEAN do? Coordination and service sector liberalization can substantially reduce costs for investors and boost intra-ASEAN. So there's a pressing need to go beyond non-tariff barriers and barriers to entry. RCEP will help to some extent in this context. Secondly, the level of digitalization and essential concomitant of servicification of manufacturing differs substantially across member countries. ASEAN does indeed have a plan for boosting digitalization and mitigating the digital divide. The agenda for this should encompass common data standards, protocols for sharing movements and cross-border movements, standardization of customs procedures, protocols at ports and airports that reduce trade costs and expedite processes. And these are fairly substantial costs if you look at the data. Also boosting data security, common data standards, and what's very essential is deepen investments in skills development in the region. As an aside, it was just last week that the Economic Development Board of Singapore, in collaboration with the World Economic Forum, released the first Smart Industry Readiness Index, called What Else But Siri, which offers an open platform to make assessment. Whoever wants to come forward to seek an assessment of deployment of fourth industrial revolution technologies. The results were quite interesting. I can talk about those later. Developing data collection, collation, interpretation is essential, not just for monitoring policy responses to policy initiatives, but also for keeping track on what is happening in the services sector and boosting coordination again. ASEAN would also benefit through regional coordination on investments, developing regulatory capabilities and capacity in coordinating regulatory initiatives across the region to prepare for the changes that lie ahead. So these measures will help ASEAN not only attract investments and new technologies, but extract maximum benefits from trade agreements, including RCEP, but diversify and deepen existing relationships. And it's important to point out here that these initiatives do not require ASEAN member states to compromise on intra-ASEAN competition to attract investment. Competition within the region is healthy, but by offering a coherent front on services, ASEAN can only enhance its individual members' competitive skills and its own credibility, resilience, and bargaining power. I'll stop here. Thank you.